Hi everyone and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now in the last lecture we talked about the progressive era in general, and now we're going to talk about the progressive era in particular. And I'd like to talk about this era through the eyes of one man, namely Teddy Roosevelt. Now I have to admit I have kind of a man crush on TR because he's pretty much the manliest president America has ever known. This was the guy who on one occasion was climbing a podium to give a campaign speech, was shot in the chest, and then finished the speech. Alright, enough of my swooning, let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
Okay, if there's one president to associate with the progressive agenda, it's Teddy Roosevelt. Now it's true that Taft and Wilson were also progressivists, but it was Roosevelt who really helped the movement pick up steam. His cornerstone program for progressivism was what was known as the Square Deal, and it included the 3 C's: control of corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. Okay, let's look at each of these in turn. First, control of corporations. Now this tenet of the Square Deal was tested immediately. In 1902, a strike broke out in the anthracite coal mines of Pennsylvania. The mine owners refused to negotiate with the miners because it was winter, and they believed that as Pennsylvanians began to feel the bite of winter without coal, they would rise up and pressure the workers to get back to it. And as coal supplies dwindled, schools and factories and hospitals were forced to shut down. Roosevelt perceived how desperate the situation was, and he invited leaders from both the workers and the mine owners to the White House, hoping that he could arbitrate. And it didn't take long before Roosevelt was profoundly annoyed by, quote, the extraordinary stupidity and bad temper of the mine owners. He later admitted that if he had not been the president and therefore in need to maintain some modicum of dignity, he would have, quote, chucked them out the window by the seat of their breeches. So finally Roosevelt said to these people, if you don't come to an agreement, I am going to seize the mines and have them operated by federal troops. After which the mine owners backed down and grudgingly accepted the terms of the mine workers. Alright, let's stay with the first C just a little bit longer so I can tell you about how much President Roosevelt loved to break up trusts. Let me try to illustrate to you what a trust is. Let's say I'm in the back waxing business. Very lucrative industry, and my business is called Follicle. And then further suppose that there's another back waxing company in town called Backs to the Future. Now if our two companies were in perfect competition as they would be in a pure free market, each of the companies would try to cut prices and offer incentives to gain more customers. And in that case, it's good for the customers. But if I, over at Follicle, decide to team up with the people over at Backs to the Future, we could set up a trust. In this scenario, we two companies would set the price for the services and then share customers. One for you, one for me. And in this scenario, the prices are always going to be higher than in a competition scenario because we are no longer in competition, and that's good for the company, but bad for the customer. So this is what Teddy Roosevelt wanted to break up because, as a rule, progressives advocated for the people against corporations. But you should know that Roosevelt didn't just attack trusts indiscriminately. He understood that large corporations were not necessarily evil. He distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts, and he went after the bad ones. Over the course of his presidency, Roosevelt brought over 40 cases against trusts so that he earned himself the nickname Trustbuster. And all of this was to make a point, namely that the government was in charge of the country, not corporations. Okay, let's look at the second C of the Square Deal, consumer protection. Now in another lecture I mentioned Upton Sinclair's expose on a Chicago meatpacking plant called The Jungle. Well, Teddy Roosevelt happened to read this book and he was sickened. So Roosevelt appointed a special investigation into the meatpacking industry, and as it turns out, Upton Sinclair was not exaggerating. Their report mentioned that it was not unusual for workers to scoop up poisoned, dead rats, mix them together with a few pieces of scrap rope ends, moisten it with some water that had leaked through the roof onto the floor, and call that potted ham, and people were eating this stuff. So in the interest of protecting the consumer, Roosevelt worked with Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Alright, let's hasten to the third C of the Square Deal, namely conservation of natural resources. When Americans began westward expansion in earnest, it seemed to them that America's natural resources could never dry up. But in the industrial boom of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the progressives, and especially Teddy Roosevelt, grew increasingly concerned about the vanishing American wilderness. Now, being an avid outdoorsman himself, Roosevelt longed to preserve the nation's forests. By 1900, only about a quarter of the virgin timber was remaining on American soil. Lumbermen had taken the rest in the interests of manufacture. In response to this, Roosevelt set aside 125 million acres in the western region as federal reserves. These were eventually to become national parks like Yosemite and the Grand Tetons. And it was the preservation of these lands which was probably Teddy Roosevelt's most enduring legacy to America. For these lands to disappear, he argued, would be the eclipse of individualism and democracy. He talked about the nation as if it had a soul, and for Roosevelt, it did. He said that he felt that whenever he stood among the redwoods of California, that he had passed into his soul, or that it had at least passed into him. And so it shouldn't surprise us to hear him talk like this. He said, "There can be nothing in the world more beautiful than Yosemite. The groves of the giant sequoias and redwoods, the canyon of the Colorado, the canyon of the Yellowstone, the Three Tetons. And our people should see to it that they are preserved for their children and their children's children forever, with their majestic beauty all unmarred." And whatever else you think about Roosevelt's politics, I think he was really onto something here. And that's all for Roosevelt and his Square Deal. I'll see you next time.